Now, this is a topic I care a lot about and have been wanting to cover for a long time, and I'm very excited to finally be getting into it. Anyway, in the last video, we talked about the Congress of Vienna and the Concert of Europe. They went to work trying to enact reforms to strengthen the empire once and for all. This effort became known as the Tanzimat. Now, let me be clear. The term Tanzimat doesn't refer to a single reform, but rather a collection of them. But even though the British were willing to help the Ottomans build their navy, here the goal was to replace the outdated and inefficient administration with a centralized and modern bureaucracy. Beginning with the Edict of 1839, the Sultan issued a series of laws that reorganized the central administration. But beyond that, they really didn't accomplish all that much. First of all, the reforms were half-hearted. Even though the Ottomans adopted many of the trappings of modernization, they never fully committed to them. If you did, make sure to hit that subscribe button so that you don't miss any more episodes. Thanks for watching. For example, the Ottomans established a constitution in 1876, but it granted the Sultan more power than the Shah of Iran, and it took another 19 years to fully implement it. Secondly, the reforms were top-down. The Ottoman elite attempted to impose modernization on the population, but they did so without addressing the needs of the people. The reforms didn't take root because they were seen as foreign and unnecessary. Finally, the reforms were piecemeal. The Ottomans tackled one issue and then moved on to the next, but they never developed a grand strategy for the future of the empire. The reality was that the Ottoman Empire was extremely complex and entrenched in tradition. The old institutions of the empire were resistant to any change, and the elite classes feared that modernization would disrupt the social order. What's more, the vast majority of the Ottomans were rural peasants who had little to gain from the reforms and everything to lose. And so, they resisted as best they could. Overall, the Tanzimat reforms were a failure, but the question is why? Why did the Ottomans fail to modernize and reform? The legal system was codified and secular courts were set up. A state bank, state railways, and state schools were established. Local governors were appointed rather than elected. The old ways of doing things were no longer sufficient to maintain the empire's stability. And so the Ottoman elite began a process of cautious reform. Whether or not those reforms were enough to save the empire remains to be seen. But one thing is for sure, the sick man of Europe was about to get a lot sicker, and the Sultan even set up a constitution in 1876. It was a cautious approach to modernization that didn't want to upset the existing order too much, and overall, it was pretty successful. The bureaucracy grew, and the revenue of the state doubled between 1839 and 1864. Not bad. The sultans refused, unless the British agreed, to stop the slave trade in the Red Sea. Of course, Britain would never agree to this. These were probably the most complicated and least successful of the lot. For the Ottomans, the goal here was to create a society that looked like pre-revolutionary France. This meant adopting French customs and culture and restructuring the social hierarchy. The first order of business was to end the millet system. If you remember from previous videos, the millet was an autonomous religious community that existed throughout the Ottoman Empire. There were Christian millet, Jewish millet, etc. And the Ottoman state protected each one in exchange for their loyalty. It was a great system that helped maintain stability in the empire for centuries. But the French thought it was outdated and suggested that the Ottomans abolish it and replace it with a French-style legal system. Now, this wasn't exactly well received by the religious minorities, so the Ottomans backed off. They did, however, institute some education reforms. Non-Muslim schools were allowed to function alongside Muslim ones, and the curriculum was updated to include secular subjects. Finally, the Ottomans also tried to improve the status of women. But this proved to be a difficult task since there was no real consensus on the role of women in Ottoman society. Some wanted to copy the French model and institute greater freedoms for women, Others wanted to limit their role in society to wife and mother. As a result, the reforms failed to bring about any real change. But the Ottomans did manage to set up a small navy nonetheless. However, it would prove ineffective when the British and French invaded Syria in 1860 to stop the Egyptian ruler Muhammad Ali from expanding further into the region. It was an embarrassing moment for the Ottomans, and a clear sign that their army and navy had a long way to go before they were effective. And as such, it is often translated as the reforms or the reorganization. The goal of these reforms was to modernize the military, to centralize and westernize the government, and to restructure society. The guiding ideology was the idea that the Ottoman Empire could be remade in the image of pre-revolutionary France. And with this in mind, the process of reform began. And if you haven't seen that video yet, then please do check it out. And while you're at it, if you love these videos, this meant that the first step was to address the issue of slavery. The Ottomans abolished slavery throughout the empire in 1845, except in the military. Since soldiers could now be recruited willingly as volunteers, they needed to be properly trained. Military schools were established to train officers, and the janissaries were reformed into a standing army. To pay for all of this, taxes were increased across the board, which was unpopular among the population, but necessary nonetheless. Additionally, the Sultan enacted a law in 1839 that required all able-bodied men to serve in the military. It was called the Law of the Marcal. Oh, and the Ottomans also bought ships and followed the Prussian example of building a railway. Really, they were just copying Prussia's entire military organization, down to their uniforms. Then subscribe so that you don't miss any more. And the Ottomans were intent on doing something about it, and so the time had come for some much-needed reforms to modernize the army, the government, and society itself. But could the reforms save the empire? Well, that's what we're here to find out. So get your sick man costumes ready, because it's time to go. Okay, welcome back to my channel. And here is the first episode of a new series focused on 19th century Europe. Anyway, where were we? Ah, yes. The Russians were a bit suspicious of this arrangement, and the Austrians were pressured to take action against them. In 1806, the Russians declared war on the Ottoman Empire and marched deep into their territory. And so began the first of two major wars that will define this period, the Greek War of Independence. In response to the Russian attack, the Ottoman Sultan was forced to seek help from the French. At the same time, an uprising broke out in Greece, demanding independence from the Ottoman Empire. After several years of fighting, the Russians eventually forced the Ottomans into the Treaty of Kacho-Kanarji in 1807, which confirmed Russia's acquisition of the northern Black Sea coast and left the rest of the Ottomans' European territories intact. Although there was still one key provision to the treaty that would shape the future of the region, the establishment of a Russian protectorate over Greece. With this, the Russians essentially controlled an autonomous Greece within the Ottoman Empire. But make no mistake, this was not independence. As far as the Ottomans were concerned, Greece was theirs. And thus, this conflict would only be the beginning of the Greek struggle for full independence. The Congress of Vienna created a conservative peace in Europe that was based on the ideas of legitimacy, interventionism, and the balance of power. This meant that there wasn't going to be any major change in Europe anytime soon. Or was there? Because right next door to the Habsburg Austrian Empire was the crumbling Ottoman Empire, or what will come to be known as the sick man of Europe. And despite the fact that they were outside Western Europe, the Ottoman Empire was caught up in the events of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. In fact, Napoleon even conquered and held parts of the empire during his reign. And as such, when he was finally defeated, the Ottoman Sultan was given territorial compensation by the Congress of Vienna. It wasn't much, but it was their only way of obtaining any satisfaction after enduring a decade of French and Russian invasions. However, in light of the Ottomans' weakness, as for the rest of the Ottomans, following this defeat, the first area of focus was the military. And since the Ottoman army was primarily made up of soldiers that were forcibly conscripted from non-Muslim subjects, now, as for the navy, they were in desperate need of ships to protect their coasts and trade routes. Moving on from the military, the next area of reform was the government.